5 recruits, 1 mess hall, 30 seconds that changed everything. They thought she was just another quiet face in the crowd, a temp worker, harmless, forgettable. By the time they closed in, blocking every exit, their smirks said it all. They were hunting for sport. One reached for her shoulder, another stepped in front of her. The air shifted, that split second before a fight when even the walls seemed to lean in, and then it began. 30 seconds later, 5 young men were sprawled across the floor, groaning in shock, clutching broken pride and bruised ribs. What happened in those 30 seconds would stay buried in classified files for years. But on this day, in this mess hall, they learned the hard way what the Navy SEAL quiet really means. This is Veteran Biker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. The sky over Fort Redhaven was bleached pale from the rising sun, a wash of light that flattened shadows and made every metal surface glare back like a mirror. The air carried the tang of diesel and baked asphalt, that particular scent every military base seems to share, no matter which corner of the world you're in. The supply yard was already alive. Forklifts trundled back and forth, pallets of MREs stacked in precise grids. Mechanics shouted over the sound of ratchets and the metallic clank of dropped tools. Somewhere near the fence line, the low thud-thud-thud of a helicopter warming up added a steady pulse to the morning soundtrack. In the middle of this organized chaos, Elara Voss moved through the supply lane with the quiet precision of someone who had been doing it for years, except she hadn't, at least not here. To anyone looking at her personnel file, she was nothing more than a temporary contractor hired to help with inventory management while the regular logistics team rotated through a training cycle. Her appearance did nothing to contradict that story. Mid-30s, dark hair drawn back into a regulation-tight bun, a faded olive-grey t-shirt tucked neatly into well-worn cargo pants, black sneakers with the kind of scuffed soles you only get from running miles, not from strolling. In one hand she carried a clipboard stacked with manifests. In the other, a capped pen she clicked absent-mindedly when she paused to scan a barcode. And yet, Master Sergeant Cole Maddox had been in the army long enough to spot the ones who didn't quite match their own paperwork. From the second week she arrived, he'd noticed the way she navigated the base, always keeping to the edges of crowded spaces, always placing herself where she could see 2 exits at once, always turning her head just enough to sweep the angles. You didn't learn that kind of habit in a warehouse. From his position on the edge of the yard, Maddox watched her work while pretending to check a cargo manifest of his own. She moved with a rhythm that was economical without being rushed, each movement deliberate, nothing wasted. Her eyes, dark, unreadable, flicked over a passing truck before returning to the crate in front of her. She didn't stare, didn't linger, but she registered it. Maddox could tell. He'd seen it before, in people who had been somewhere they shouldn't have survived, in those who'd learned that awareness was more than a skill, it was insurance. The collision happened almost casually. Mason Kerrigan and Rafe Varela were heading in the opposite direction, both dressed in fresh PT gear that still looked like it had been issued yesterday. Mason walked with the easy swagger of a man convinced the world would meet him halfway. Rafe trailed half a step behind, a permanent smirk etched onto his face like it had been carved there in high school and never sanded down. They were talking too loudly about something trivial, the kind of pointless banter designed to be overheard, when Mason angled his shoulder just enough to slam into Elara as they passed. The hit wasn't accidental. It had the sharp, deliberate force of someone making a point. The clipboard went spinning from her hand, pages scattering across the sun-bleached pavement like oversized confetti. The pen bounced twice before rolling under a nearby pallet. Mason didn't slow down. "Watch where you're going," he said without looking at her, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry over the idle engine noise. Rafe laughed, the sound thin and sharp. Yeah, careful with all that important paper shuffling. Elara knelt, gathering the pages in the exact order they'd been before. Her movements were unhurried, her face unreadable. "My mistake," she said. The words were quiet but not submissive. Maddox, watching from 20 feet away, caught the subtle neutrality in her tone, the kind of even delivery that didn't escalate, didn't retreat, but set a line. If Mason heard it, he ignored it. He and Rafe kept walking, their shoulders loose, their voices still too loud. But twice, Maddox noticed, Mason looked back over his shoulder, and there it was. The hook had set. Maddox knew that look. It was the look of a young soldier who just stumbled across something he didn't understand but was convinced he could dominate. He'd seen it a dozen times, and it always ended in one of two ways: a swift, ugly course correction or a spectacular mistake. Elara finished collecting her papers, straightened, and scanned the yard once before tucking the clipboard under her arm. For a fraction of a second, her gaze passed over Maddox, and he saw the faint narrowing of her eyes. She'd clocked him, registered his position, his line of sight. Then, without a word, she turned and continued toward the storage bay. Most of the yard went back to its noise and motion, the brief interruption already forgotten by everyone else. But Maddox kept watching, his jaw tightening. The day wasn't done with her yet. It was barely 0900 when the first whispers started. By the time Maddox made it to the mess line for his second cup of coffee, he'd already overheard 3 versions of the collision. In one, Mason claimed she'd walked straight into him while daydreaming about counting bolts. In another, Rafe suggested she'd deliberately brushed against Mason and then played innocent. The third was just laughter, the kind that comes from a group who found a new in-joke they planned to run into the ground. None of it sat right with Maddox. Not because he thought Elara needed defending, he was increasingly sure she could handle herself, but because he'd seen what happened when overconfident rookies mistook composure for weakness. Elara, for her part, gave no indication the morning had been out of the ordinary. She moved through the chow line like everyone else, took a seat near the windows, back to the wall, of course, and ate without hurry. Her eyes tracked the room, but only in glances so casual you'd miss them if you weren't looking. When she was done, she stacked her tray neatly, wiped down her spot, and left without speaking to anyone. Maddox lingered. From where he sat, he could see Mason and Rafe enter the mess hall just as Elara was leaving. The timing wasn't accidental. Maddox would have bet his last stripe on that. Mason's eyes followed her out, his expression somewhere between curiosity and calculation. They hadn't learned a thing from this morning, and in Maddox's experience, that meant the real trouble was still to come. By 1300, the supply yard was quiet again. Most of the work shifted indoors to the motor pool and the comms shed. Elara was there, moving crates of outdated radio units onto a rolling cart. The air inside smelled of dust and warm metal, and the dim light gave everything a muted, almost sepia cast. She didn't hear Mason and Rafe come in until their boots were on the concrete behind her. "You really into this stuff?" Mason said, leaning a shoulder against the doorframe. "Or is it just the only job they'd give you?" Elara didn't turn around. "I'm working," Rafe laughed. "Hear that? She's working!" Maddox, who had just stepped into the adjacent bay, froze where he was, the hair on his neck prickling. He couldn't see them from this angle, but he could hear every word. There was a scrape of a crate shifting. "You know," Mason said, "most people here make an effort. Talk, join in. You..." He gestured. Maddox could picture it. At her posture, her focus. "You act like you're too good for everyone." Elara set down her pen and finally looked at them. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes, dark and steady, didn't blink. "I'm not too good to talk to people," she said evenly. "I'm too busy to talk to you." Silence for a beat. Then Rafe whistled low. "Ouch." Mason just smiled, a thin, flat smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Fair enough. Maybe we'll catch you at chow sometime. You can show us your friendly side." They left, but not before Mason glanced back again, like he couldn't quite leave it alone. Maddox stepped into the comm shed after they'd gone. "Everything all right in here?" Elara nodded. "Fine." Her tone made it clear she didn't need or want interference. Maddox respected that. But he also knew where this road went. Some lessons, he thought grimly, are only learned the hard way, and if Mason Kerrigan kept pushing, that lesson was coming sooner than he realized. It started with small things, the kind of background static that goes unnoticed by most but carries a deliberate edge. Passing her in the narrow hall between the admin offices and the storage bays, Mason letting his shoulder brush hers just enough to claim space without outright confrontation. Rafe's sudden habit of laughing at something as she walked by, head turned toward Mason, the two of them sharing that smug half-smile that only made sense if you were in on the joke. Elara didn't respond, not with words, not with looks, not with anything beyond the minimum movement required to get where she was going. That, for Mason, was gasoline on a spark. By Thursday, the unit, as Mason, Rafe, Troy Madron, Luke Serrano, and Evan Rocha had started calling themselves, had taken to watching for her. They'd clock her location during morning PT, note her route back to the supply yard, and make small adjustments to their own schedules so they could bump into her more often. It was the kind of pattern anyone trained in surveillance would notice in under an hour. Elara noticed it before lunch on the first day. She didn't need to look over her shoulder to confirm the rhythm of her day had shifted in tiny, telltale ways. Steps that used to be uninterrupted now had echoes 2 beats behind. Conversations in the periphery of her hearing cut off when she changed direction. The same faces appearing in different corners of the base, always just coincidentally in her path. She made a note, not on paper, but in the mental filing system that had kept her alive in places far less forgiving than Fort Redhaven. She didn't alter her pace. She didn't tell anyone. Changing her meal schedule had been her concession. She wouldn't be making another. In another life, Master Sergeant Cole Maddox might have stepped in by now, shut down the behavior before it metastasized into something that would require paperwork and medical reports. But Maddox had learned the hard way that interference could sometimes rob people of the chance to settle things on their own terms, and something told him Elara Voss didn't need a rescuer. What she needed was room. Still, he watched and he listened. That was how he caught the tail end of Mason and Rafe's conversation outside the motor pool Friday morning, their voices pitched just low enough to suggest they knew they shouldn't be overheard. "Told you she's hiding something," Mason was saying, a tightness in his tone that wasn't curiosity anymore. It was fixation. No one's that quiet unless they've got something to hide. Rafe's reply came with a scoff. "Or maybe she just thinks she's better than the rest of us." Either way, we're gonna find out. The way he said it made Maddox's teeth clench. Find out had a dozen meanings, most of them bad when spoken by young men in a pack. The opportunity they were looking for presented itself faster than even Maddox anticipated. Saturday morning was a slow shift for most of the base. Weekend rotation meant fewer scheduled drills, more personal time for those not on duty, and a relaxed pace in the mess hall, especially during the late breakfast window when the crowd thinned to a trickle. Elara, having decided to reclaim her preferred eating time, was seated at her usual table near the windows, the tray in front of her holding black coffee and what passed for scrambled eggs under a heat lamp. She ate with the same deliberate pace she brought to every task, eyes taking in the room without telegraphing the fact that she was tracking anyone. Mason spotted her from the doorway. He'd been talking to Troy, Luke, and Evan about something unrelated. Weekend leave, maybe, or who'd be stuck with KP duty. But the sight of her cut through whatever the conversation had been. His expression shifted in a way that made Troy glance at Rafe knowingly. The plan didn't need to be spoken aloud. They'd been circling it all week. They entered together, not in formation, but close enough to project cohesion. Mason led, Rafe flanking slightly to the rear, Troy and Luke widening the line, and Evan hanging back far enough to cut off the side exit if needed. To a casual observer, it might have looked like 5 men just walking into a mess hall. To Elara, it was a net closing. She didn't tense. Her fork kept moving, the steady lift and chew of someone completely at ease, but her peripheral vision mapped their positions the way a cartographer marks a coastline, precise, fixed, undeniable. She clocked the angle from her chair to the nearest open space. The placement of the 2 night shift MPs still lingering over late breakfast. The distance to the serving line, where a kitchen worker scrubbed trays with his back to the room. Mason reached her table first. "Morning," he said, voice pitched to Carrie. Elara sipped her coffee. "Morning." Rafe leaned on the back of the chair opposite her. "We were just talking about you." She didn't look at him. "Can't imagine why." "Because you're a mystery," Mason said, pulling out the chair across from her and sitting without invitation. "And mysteries need solving." Her gaze slid to him, cool and level. "Not interested." Luke chuckled. "That's the problem. You think you get to decide how this goes." Evan had drifted behind her now, his casual posture betrayed by the way his weight was balanced, ready to move forward fast. Maddox had entered the mess hall halfway through this exchange. He stopped just inside the doorway, hands in his pockets, eyes on the scene unfolding. This was the moment when a voice of authority could still diffuse it without broken bones or a disciplinary cascade. He didn't move. Not yet. Mason smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We figure you either start acting like part of the team or we make you." Elara's fork paused in midair. "Make me?" "Yeah," Rafe said. "Start with a little honesty. What's your deal?" "I manage inventory." "That's not a deal," Luke said. "That's a job. We're talking about the real you." "You don't want to know the real me," she said evenly. "Oh, I think we do," Mason replied. "In fact, we're gonna find out." Troy stepped forward from Elara's right, placing a hand lightly, too lightly to be friendly, on her shoulder, as if steering her toward some unspoken destination. "Why don't you come with us? Have a little chat. Somewhere quieter." The contact was the line. In another environment, maybe she would have stood, brushed past them and walked away. But this was her table, her time, and 5 men were working very hard to turn it into theirs. She set the fork down, picked up her coffee, and took one slow sip before placing the cup exactly where it had been. Then she removed Troy's hand, not roughly, not enough to attract attention from the other side of the room, just a precise grip on his wrist, a downward turn, and a release that left him blinking in confusion at how quickly she'd broken contact. "You don't want to do that," she said. The words were quiet, but the timbre carried. Mason's smirk faltered for a heartbeat before returning. "We'll see about that." Maddox saw it then. The inevitability. He'd seen too many confrontations go past the point of no return, but he still didn't move. The calculus was shifting, and part of him wanted to see exactly how far Mason would push before the cliff gave way beneath him, and Elara, calm as glass, was giving him all the rope he needed. From there, the tension in the mess hall was a living thing. The 2 MPs by the far wall had noticed something, but weren't yet invested enough to intervene. A tray clattered in the kitchen. Outside, a forklift beeped as it reversed. Inside, the 5-man net tightened by another half step. Mason leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Last chance, Voss. You can walk with us now, or—" He let the sentence trail off, the implied threat heavy in the air. Her eyes didn't leave his. "Or what?" He smiled again, but it looked strained now. "Or we make you wish you had." And that was the moment, Maddox realized, when this stopped being a game. The mess hall seemed to narrow around them, the bright midday light spilling through the windows, doing nothing to warm the air. Mason's stare held steady, the weight of his challenge pressing down like a physical force, his friends shifting subtly to close off what little space remained between Elara and any possible exit. She stayed seated, posture loose but aligned, her gaze flicking once to Troy, then to Evan, reading not just their positions, but their weight distribution, the set of their shoulders, the telltale tightening in the hands that meant they were moments away from acting. No one else in the room moved. The two MPs at the far wall continued their quiet conversation, their body language saying they'd noticed something but not enough to interfere yet. The hum of the refrigeration units in the kitchen became an odd, steady counterpoint to the unspoken countdown hanging over the table. Rafe leaned forward, his knuckles pressing into the laminate, the half grin on his face trying to mask the anticipation in his eyes. "You can make this easy," he said, his tone a poor imitation of control. "Or you can make it messy." Elara let her eyes rest on his for a long second, before replying in the same calm, even cadence she'd used since they approached. "You're confusing messy with dangerous. They're not the same." Luke chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as though she'd said something absurd. Mason straightened slightly in his chair, scanning her expression for any flicker of discomfort. He found none, and that in itself seemed to push him further. "Stand up," he said. She didn't. Instead, she reached for her coffee, took a slow sip and placed it back on the tray with precision. That small act of composure acted like a spark to dry tinder. Troy shifted again, impatient, his hand flexing as though he needed something to grab. Evan moved half a step closer behind her, the space between his shadow and her shoulder now barely an inch. Ilara's voice cut through the static. "You've already decided what you're going to do. Get on with it." The words landed like a slap, not in volume but in the absolute absence of fear. Mason exhaled sharply through his nose as if making a choice. "All right," he said, leaning back, motioning with two fingers toward her. "Help her up." Troy reached down toward her shoulder again, and this time she didn't remove his hand gently. Her left arm came up in a sharp, practiced arc, catching his wrist, rotating it outward and down in a motion so quick it was almost invisible to the untrained eye. The sudden torque made his knees buckle, his face tightening with pain as his free hand instinctively moved to relieve the pressure. She let go before he could stumble, the release timed so he had to catch his own balance without falling, an act that should have de-escalated the moment, but instead lit another fuse. "You're dead," Troy muttered, rubbing his wrist. Mason's smirk returned, thinner this time. Big mistake. The net closed completely. Rafe slid into the chair to her left, blocking that side. Luke planted himself at an angle near the table's corner, while Evan's stance behind her shifted from casual to poised. Mason leaned forward again, elbows braced, his voice dropping low. "You want to play tough? Let's see how tough you are." His right hand reached across the table, fingers brushing the edge of her tray like he might push it away to clear space. She let him. Her eyes followed his hand for a fraction of a second before lifting back to his face. "You don't want to do this." "Oh," Rafe said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes, "we really do." And with that, Evan's hand descended toward her shoulder, intending to grip and haul her upright. The instant his fingers brushed the fabric of her shirt, she moved. Her left elbow drove backward in a short, violent arc, striking him square in the midsection just beneath the ribcage. The air left him in a wheezing grunt as he staggered back a half step. She was already pushing up from her seat, her right knee snapping up under the table's edge, catching Mason just as he started to rise. The sickening crack of bone and cartilage was muffled only slightly by the table between them, his head snapping back with a spray of red across his upper lip. The chair leg screeched against the floor as she shoved it aside to clear her path. Rafe lunged, but his reach met only the ghost of where she'd been a heartbeat earlier. She stepped inside his swing, hooked his lead leg with her own, and drove her shoulder into his chest, using his momentum to spin and dump him sideways into Luke, who had been moving in from the flank. Both went down in a tangle, Luke swearing as they hit the tile. Troy, still nursing his wrist, came in low in an attempt to grab her around the waist. She pivoted sharply, planted her right foot, and brought the heel of her left hand up into his jaw with enough force to snap his head back and drop him to his knees. Evan, regaining some breath, came at her again from behind, but she was already turning, catching his arm at the elbow and twisting it into a joint lock that forced him forward onto the nearest overturned chair. A sharp strike to the back of his knee completed the takedown, leaving him gasping on the floor. Mason tried to push himself upright, blood streaming from his nose, but she stepped over and pressed a palm to his chest, shoving him back into the wall hard enough to rattle the chair rail. Her other hand rested lightly at her side, not clenched into a fist, not threatening, just ready. The entire sequence had lasted less than 30 seconds. Now, the only sounds were the labored breathing of 5 men in varying states of pain and the faint clatter of a dropped fork somewhere at the far end of the room. She stood in the center of the chaos, posture steady, chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. Her gaze swept each of them in turn, not lingering on the damage she'd done, but making sure none of them was about to try something foolish. Mason's voice came out thick, distorted by the swelling in his nose. "What the hell are you?" She crouched slightly, meeting his eyes with a calm that made the question itself seem irrelevant. "Petty Officer First Class Elara Voss, United States Navy, SEAL Team 4, 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. 37 confirmed kills, 16 up close. I'm on medical leave while the Navy decides if my injuries are enough to retire me. I am not a contractor." The words were delivered without boast, without heat, just facts. Facts that settled over the group like a weighted blanket they couldn't push off. She straightened, took up her coffee again, and drained the last swallow before setting the empty cup down. "I changed my schedule to avoid you. I stayed out of your way. You decided quiet meant weak. That was your mistake." No one answered. Rafe was still on his back, one hand pressed to his chest where she'd driven her shoulder into him. Luke was propped against a table leg, rubbing his temple. Troy sat on the floor with his head hanging, jaw working as if to test if it was still intact. Evan leaned on the overturned chair, one arm cradled against his body. Mason slumped against the wall, eyes narrowed, face pale beneath the streaks of blood. Elara adjusted her shirt, collected her tray, and walked it to the dish return. She rinsed the cup, stacked the plate, set the silverware exactly where it belonged. Then she turned and left the mess hall without looking back. The silence in her wake was absolute. When the MPs finally crossed the room, their eyes moved over the scene. Sprawled bodies, overturned furniture, food smeared on the tile, and then to the doorway she'd just exited. One of them let out a low whistle. What the hell happened here? None of the 5 gave a full answer. The story, whatever version they would settle on, would avoid certain truths, that they'd gone looking for a demonstration of weakness and instead found a wall of skill and experience they couldn't breach. By the time word began to filter through the base, the details would already be distorted, trimmed of specifics, exaggerated in some places and downplayed in others. But one point would remain unchanged in every retelling, that 5 men had cornered one woman in the mess hall, and less than a minute later they'd been lying on the floor, nursing injuries they couldn't quite explain. For Elara Voss, the incident was already behind her. For Mason Kerrigan and his unit, it was a line carved into their personal history, one they would carry in silence, because some defeats weren't just losses, they were reminders. By the time the mess hall door swung shut behind Elara Voss, the air inside had shifted from charged to suffocating. The MPs moved in with the deliberate pace of men walking through a minefield they couldn't yet see. They didn't need to raise their voices. Their presence alone tightened the posture of every conscious person in the room. Mason was the first to speak, if it could be called that. A congested nasal mutter that bled into a cough when one of the MPs crouched beside him. "Sit still," the MP said, examining the angle of his swelling nose. "You need a medic." Mason didn't argue. He let himself be helped into a seated position against the wall, the fight's edge replaced by the weight of physical consequence. Rafe was still flat on his back, eyes fixed on the ceiling as though it might shift into a friendlier reality if he stared long enough. Troy muttered something about a sore jaw. Luke and Evan were quiet, their silence the uneasy kind that comes when the brain is still trying to replay the last 60 seconds and find the moment it all went wrong. In the corner, Maddox watched without moving. He'd seen fights broken up before, seen cocky recruits limp away with bruises that taught them more than lectures ever could. But this wasn't that. This was different. Calculated, clean, over before anyone in the room had time to intervene. It told him what he'd suspected since the day she walked onto the base. Elara wasn't someone you stumbled into defeating. She was someone you left alone. The MPs began separating the group, pairing each man with a different escort to avoid collusion on their stories. A medic team arrived with stretchers for those who couldn't walk without assistance. They asked questions, but the answers were vague, full of omissions, misunderstanding, got out of hand, no big deal. Maddox could have laughed if the situation hadn't been so predictable. They were too embarrassed to tell the truth, too aware of what it would sound like. 5 trained soldiers cornering a lone woman who had dropped them all in under a minute. Within the hour, the incident report was already in motion. The base commander was briefed, the mess hall sealed for cleanup, and the surveillance footage flagged for review. Maddox knew it wouldn't take long for the chain of command to start calling names, and his own would be near the top, if only because he'd been in the vicinity. He found her that evening, not in her quarters, not in the chow line, but out on the perimeter road, moving at a steady run that matched the fading light. The sun was dipping low, cutting long shadows across the asphalt, and the steady rhythm of her footsteps was the only sound until he closed the gap enough to be heard. "You could have handled that differently," he said. No accusation, no heat, just the truth of it. She didn't slow. "And let them think they were right about me. Sometimes walking away buys you more than you lose." She glanced at him then, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, and sometimes it invites them to try harder next time. They ran in silence for a stretch, the air cooling with each minute. Maddox wasn't in bad shape for his age, but keeping pace with her took more effort than he liked to admit. "They're going to make noise about this," he said finally. "They can make all the noise they want." Her breathing was steady, unlabored. "I've already moved on," doesn't mean they have, or the people above them. She didn't answer that. Instead, she veered toward a narrow track leading back toward the contractor housing. "I'm not looking for trouble, Master Sergeant, but I'm not avoiding it at the expense of self-respect either." He watched her disappear down the track. He wasn't sure whether to admire her resolve or worry about how it would collide with the bureaucracy now stirring into life behind the scenes. By morning, the summons came. Formal, typed, bearing the base commander's seal. Elara was to report to the administrative conference room at 0900. Maddox got one too, as a witness. The MPs who'd responded to the scene had theirs as well. Mason and his unit were each scheduled for individual interviews, separated by hours to prevent any more whispered alignments of their stories. The conference room was all angles and austerity, the blinds half closed to cut the sun into measured strips across the table. At the head sat Colonel Reeve, the kind of officer whose clipped sentences carried more weight than most men's shouts. To his right, the base legal advisor, a woman with an open laptop and a pen tapping against the edge of her notepad in a steady rhythm. On the left, the senior MP who'd walked into the mess hall aftermath. Elara took the seat indicated without comment. She didn't fidget, didn't cross her arms, just sat with her hands folded on the table, eyes forward. Maddox sat 2 chairs down, close enough to see the fine scar along her jawline catch the light. Colonel Reeve began without preamble. "We've reviewed the footage from yesterday. It's instructive." He let the word hang, not quite approving, not quite condemning. "You incapacitated 5 soldiers in approximately 28 seconds. Elara didn't respond. The legal advisor leaned forward. "Ms. Voss, can you explain for the record what led to this confrontation?" Her voice was steady. "5 soldiers surrounded me while I was eating. They blocked the exits, made verbal demands, and initiated physical contact. I acted to remove the threat." "Remove the threat," the MP repeated, as if testing the phrase for accuracy. "You did more than remove it. You dismantled it." She met his gaze. "They stopped being a threat when they were on the floor." Reeve interlaced his fingers. "You could have called for assistance. I didn't have time. And yet you had time to—" He glanced at the notes. "Drive an elbow into one man's solar plexus, break another's nose, execute 2 sweeps and a joint lock. I trained for worse in less time." There was a silence then, filled only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. Maddox could see Reeve weighing the angles, discipline versus discretion, the optics of punishing someone who'd been cornered versus the need to maintain order. The legal advisor spoke again. "Your file lists you as a temporary civilian contractor. Would you care to clarify your actual background for the record?" Elara's answer was measured. "Petty Officer First Class, United States Navy, SEAL Team 4, currently on medical leave pending discharge status." The tapping pen stopped. The advisor's expression shifted, not surprise exactly, but an acknowledgement that the undercurrent in the room had just changed. Reeve's gaze sharpened. "That information is not in the personnel system accessible to this base. It's not meant to be," she said. The MP sat back. "Well, that explains the technique." "It explains nothing," Elara replied. "I didn't fight because I'm a SEAL. I fought because 5 men left me no other option." Maddox found himself stepping in, uninvited. "Sir, I've seen the way those 5 operate. This was coming. She just happened to be the first one to stand her ground." Reeve cut him a look that said he was overstepping, but didn't tell him to stop. "That may be," the colonel said, "but we can't have incidents like this becoming part of the culture here. We're a training environment, not a proving ground for personal grudges." "With respect," Elara said, "they made it one. I ended it. It was bold, but she didn't deliver it like a challenge. It was simply her read of the situation, and Reeve seemed to understand that." He closed the folder in front of him. "For the record, you'll receive a written warning about engagement with enlisted personnel. No further disciplinary action. The 5 involved will face internal review." It was as clean an exit as anyone could hope for, but the looks passed between the people at that table said it wasn't the end, just the point where the official record stopped keeping up with reality. Outside, Maddox fell into step beside her. "That went better than it could have." "I've been in worse rooms," she said. "They're not done," he warned. "They'll chew on this for weeks. Might try to use it later." She gave a small shrug. "Let them. I don't plan on sticking around long enough for it to matter." He studied her a moment. "You planning on disappearing again?" Her eyes stayed on the path ahead. "I never stopped." They reached the junction where the walkways split toward the contractor quarters and the motor pool. She turned toward the housing without another word, leaving him with the sense that whatever trail she was on, it didn't start or end here. The rest of the base moved on quickly, as it always does. New drills, fresh supply runs, a rotation of personnel that brought in new faces to replace old ones. But in the quieter corners, in the gym after hours, in the smoking area behind the motor pool, over late-night coffee in the comms shed, the story of the mess hall still passed in low voices. Not the classified details, not the name SEAL Team 4, but enough to shape the legend 5 against 1 over in seconds. No wasted motion. Mason and his crew were less visible. Medical appointments and restricted duties kept them out of the usual routines. When they did appear, they carried themselves with the brittle wariness of men who'd learned a private lesson the hard way. No one asked them about it directly. They didn't volunteer. Maddox noticed that Elara's perimeter runs shifted back to their original time. She reclaimed her seat in the mess hall, same table by the window, same methodical arrangement of tray and utensils. If anyone new tried to take the chair opposite hers, they found her eyes on them just long enough to make them choose a different spot. Life on base didn't stop for one fight, no matter how clean or decisive. But for the people who'd seen it, or even just heard enough pieces to imagine it, the mess hall was different now. The walls seemed to hold the memory, the floor under certain tables carrying a faint echo of chairs scraping back, the sudden thud of bodies hitting tile. Maddox knew better than to think it was over. Trouble had a way of circling back, testing fences for weak points. But he also knew Elara Voss wasn't anyone's weak point. And if trouble came again, he suspected it would find her ready, the same way she'd been in those 30 seconds that had already become part of Fort Redhaven's unofficial history. 2 weeks passed, and Fort Redhaven's rhythm settled back into its usual pattern, but the undercurrent of the mess hall incident still threaded through conversations in ways that no one openly acknowledged. Recruits who hadn't been there spoke with a kind of borrowed authority, weaving the fragments they'd heard into embellished narratives that made the moment larger than life. The 5 who had been there, Mason, Rafe, Troy, Luke and Evan, kept their heads down, their public interactions trimmed to the bare minimum, their swagger muted. In the official sense, the matter was closed. Colonel Reeves' warning to Elara Voss was filed, the disciplinary measures for the 5 quietly implemented, and the base's daily orders carried no trace of what had happened. But in the places where rank didn't reach, the weight room in the motor pool's loft, the benches outside the barracks at dusk, the back row of the briefing hall, the fight had become a cautionary tale. The details shifted depending on who told it, but certain elements stayed fixed. A woman alone at a table, surrounded by 5 men, 30 seconds of violence executed with surgical precision. Some left out the fact that she walked away without a scratch. Others leaned on it. The result was the same. The next time Elara entered a room, eyes tracked her with a subtle mix of curiosity and wariness. She didn't appear to notice, and if she did, she gave no sign. She kept her routines exactly as before. The same perimeter runs at dawn, the same measured pace in the chow line, the same silent focus on her work in the supply yard. She neither courted conversation nor avoided it, but her replies, when given, were brief and functional. It was enough to make the new arrivals wonder what lay beneath the surface. Master Sergeant Cole Maddox noticed something else. The story wasn't staying inside the base. One afternoon in the admin office, a visiting logistics coordinator from another installation mentioned in an offhand tone that word travels fast, and then smiled faintly without elaborating. A week later, Maddox caught 2 Air Force personnel from the nearby Joint Training Detachment watching Elara during lunch. Their conversation quiet, but their eyes sharp, like they were studying a known variable rather than a mystery. It wasn't hard to imagine how the whispers had spread. Military circles were small, and stories with the right mix of humiliation and skill tended to move quickly, even without names attached. What unsettled Maddox wasn't that people knew, but that some seemed to recognize her. One Friday morning, as Elara was unloading a shipment of field radios, a man in navy khakis approached. Mid-40s, salt and pepper hair, the kind of posture that marked him as someone who'd spent years in operational command. His insignia was obscured by the open jacket, but the silver pin at his collar was enough to place him. He stopped just inside the bay, watching her work for a moment before speaking. "Petty Officer Voss." She froze, but only for a fraction of a second, then turned slowly to face him. Her expression was neutral, but Maddox, standing a few feet away, saw the shift in her eyes, the recognition, the calculation. "Sir," she said. It wasn't a question. The man smiled faintly. "Didn't expect to find you here." His gaze swept the cramped space, taking in the crates, the worn clipboard in her hand, the dust settling on the concrete floor. "Though I suppose I shouldn't be surprised." Maddox glanced between them, sensing a history he wasn't privy to. "I'm here on temporary assignment," Elara said. Her tone made it clear that was all she intended to offer. The man seemed to accept that, but there was something in the way he studied her that made Maddox's instincts prickle. Respect, yes, but also the weight of unfinished business. "We'll talk before I leave," he said finally, and walked out without waiting for her reply. She went back to her work, but her movements were sharper, each motion measured as if she were reining in the impulse to put the crate down and follow him. Maddox didn't ask. By the next day, the Navy officer was gone, his visit logged only in the standard duty roster, but the shift in atmosphere lingered. A handful of people seemed to watch her differently, with a recognition that wasn't born from the mess hall story. Maddox put the pieces together slowly. SEAL Team 4, medical leave, a network of contacts that didn't dissolve just because her official role had. The mess hall fight might have been the spark, but it wasn't the whole fire. On Sunday afternoon, a convoy from the Joint Training Detachment rolled in. 3 vehicles, a mix of Army and Navy personnel. Among them was a lean, quiet man in civilian clothes who moved with the same economy Elara did. He caught sight of her in the yard and broke into a slow smile, the kind that belonged to someone who hadn't seen a comrade in years. She didn't smile back, but she didn't turn away either. They stood facing each other for a moment, the noise of the yard dimming around them, until he gave a slight nod and continued toward the command building. Maddox noticed that interaction too. The next morning, Elara's name appeared on the operations office log, not in the contractor section, but under a restricted access meeting entry. She was gone for 3 hours, returned without explanation, and resumed her duties as if nothing had happened. The difference was in the way some of the senior staff looked at her afterward, not surprised, not even impressed, but as though she had been reclassified in their minds from background to asset. For the 5 who'd cornered her in the mess hall, this was the final turn of the screw. Mason avoided the supply yard entirely now, taking alternate routes across base to keep their paths from crossing. Rafe kept his conversations short and eyes averted. Troy, Luke and Evan did their best to blend into the larger rotation of duties, but the tension was there, just under the surface. None of them had been told officially who she was beyond the Navy service she'd admitted in the conference room. None needed more detail to understand they'd picked the wrong target. The base, for its part, had moved on in the way military environments always did, absorbing the event into its lore, filing it away as both warning and legend. But Maddox knew better. What had happened in those 30 seconds was only the visible portion of something much deeper. And now that depth was drawing attention from beyond Fort Redhaven's perimeter. When the next shift in the air came, it wouldn't be from 5 overconfident recruits. It would be from people who knew exactly who Elara Voss was, and exactly why that mattered. By midweek, the signs were clear to Maddox. Elara Voss wasn't going to be on Fort Redhaven much longer. The frequency of visitors from outside commands had increased subtly. Each arrival logged as routine coordination or cross-unit support. Yet more than once, Maddox spotted one or two of them pausing when they passed her in the yard, the glance a fraction too long, the expression too knowing. In a place where everyone was supposed to be defined by their current assignment, she was being defined by something else, something unspoken but understood by those who recognized her. The official explanation came on Thursday morning in the form of a sealed envelope delivered to the contractor housing. Elara opened it without ceremony in the corner of the mess hall, scanning the short block of text before folding the paper in half and slipping it into her pocket. Maddox, seated 2 tables over, caught her eye briefly. The smallest shake of her head told him she wasn't going to discuss it there. It wasn't until that evening, in the quiet outside the motor pool, that she spoke. "Transfer orders," she said. "Effective immediately." She didn't say where to, and Maddox didn't ask. There were times when knowing less was safer. "Guess that means you won't have to worry about me causing trouble anymore." Her voice carried no resentment, only the steady acceptance of someone used to moving on without fanfare. He studied her for a moment. "You didn't cause trouble. You ended it. That's not how the paperwork will read." She gave the faintest smile, more in her eyes than on her lips. "But that's all right. I'm not here for the paperwork." The next morning she was in the yard early, returning issued gear and signing off on the final checklists. Her movements were as precise as the first day she'd arrived. No wasted steps, no lingering over goodbyes. A few of the permanent staff came by to shake her hand or offer a short nod, those who'd seen enough to respect her without needing the details. Mason and his crew were nowhere in sight. Maddox suspected they'd been informed of her departure but had chosen to stay out of view, whether out of embarrassment or relief he couldn't tell. If Elara noticed their absence, she didn't show it. By 0900, a dark SUV with no unit markings rolled through the gate and stopped beside the admin building. The driver stayed inside, engine running, while a man in civilian clothes stepped out and scanned the area. When his eyes found Elara, he raised a hand in a gesture that was more signal than greeting. She picked up her duffel, slung it over her shoulder, and crossed the yard without looking back. Maddox watched from the shade of the motor pool entrance. She didn't slow, didn't pause to take in the view of the base one last time. The rear door opened. She slid inside, and the SUV pulled away with the same quiet efficiency she'd carried every day she was here. The dust from its tires settled quickly, leaving the yard looking exactly as it had before she arrived, and yet different in ways only those who'd crossed her path would understand. The mess hall would see new arguments, new rivalries, but for a long time, the story of those 30 seconds would hang over it, shaping how people measured each other before making assumptions. Later that day, Maddox found the table by the window empty and sat there for the first time. He could see why she'd chosen it, the sight lines, the way the light fell without glare, the subtle angle to both exits. It was the kind of detail you only noticed after someone taught you to. Fort Redhaven's routines resumed as if she'd never been there. But in the quiet corners of the base, in the places where stories outlasted the people who lived them, the name Elara Voss would carry weight. Not because of a title or even because of what she'd done, but because of what she'd shown. That silence is not weakness, and some lessons can only be taught once. And somewhere beyond the perimeter, wherever that SUV was taking her, she was already stepping into another place where no one knew her yet. And where, if history was any guide, they would eventually learn. Fort Redhaven didn't speak her name much after she left, but the mark Elara Voss left behind didn't fade. The mess hall incident had shifted something in the undercurrent of the base's social structure, invisible to official reports but clear to anyone paying attention. Conversations were shorter in certain corridors, laughter less careless when directed at someone new. The easy arrogance some recruits brought with them from civilian life now carried a hesitation, as if each one weighed the possibility that the quietest person in the room might not be who they seemed. Master Sergeant Cole Maddox felt the difference most in the training fields. He watched squads move with a little more discipline, heard fewer flippant comments when new personnel arrived. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible unless you'd been there before the change, but it was real. Even the 5 who had stood around her table that day had been altered. Mason Kerrigan still had his broad-shouldered presence, but the way he carried it now lacked the same edge of casual dominance. He spoke less in groups, and when he did, his eyes flickered, as if measuring the possible consequences of his words. Rafe Varela no longer prowled the hallways with the same smirk. It was there sometimes, but dimmed, used sparingly. Troy Madron avoided lingering in communal areas altogether, preferring the anonymity of extra duties. Luke Serrano put more effort into physical training, as if by sharpening himself he could erase the memory of being thrown to the floor. Evan Rocha kept his head down, his wiry energy channeled into tasks no one volunteered for. None of them apologized, not in words, but the absence of their previous behavior was its own kind of admission. Outside that circle, the mess hall story kept mutating. For some, Elara was a nameless contractor who'd snapped after weeks of provocation. For others, she was an undercover officer testing base discipline. A few swore she was still there, working in some classified section no one had clearance for. Maddox never corrected any version. The truth belonged to those who'd been in the room, and even they didn't agree on every detail. In quieter moments, he caught himself thinking about their last conversation, the flat certainty in her voice when she said she'd never stopped disappearing. It made sense now, watching the way her absence had become a presence of its own. Her name wasn't on any roster, her boots weren't on any floor, but the effect of her 30 seconds was everywhere. Some of the younger recruits began emulating parts of her manner without realizing it, choosing seats with their backs to the wall, scanning a room's corners before relaxing, speaking less and observing more. It was as if an unspoken manual had been distributed, its only chapter titled, "Pay Attention." The base commander never mentioned her again after the official close of the incident, but Maddox noticed he'd stopped brushing off reports of low-level harassment between personnel. Warnings were given sooner, interventions swifter. It was policy by osmosis, born not from orders, but from the memory of what could happen when small provocations were allowed to snowball unchecked. A month after her departure, a supply convoy rolled in from a neighboring installation. Among the drivers was a man Maddox recognized from years back, a Navy petty officer with a knack for hearing things before they became common knowledge. Over coffee in the admin building, the man leaned across the table. "Heard you had a situation here. 5 on 1. Over before anyone could blink." Maddox didn't confirm or deny, just sipped his coffee. The man smirked. "Yeah, figured she'd move on fast. She's been spotted in 2 different theaters since. Always under some other name." He leaned back, studying Maddox. "Guess she left her mark here, though." Maddox said nothing, but later that day, walking past the mess hall, he saw the table by the window was still empty more often than not. No one had claimed it. It wasn't officially reserved, but it carried a kind of unspoken ownership, as if the space itself remembered. That was the thing about moments like that day. When they were over, the place never returned entirely to what it had been before. Something stayed behind, invisible but shaping behavior, changing the rules without anyone writing them down. And somewhere out there, Maddox thought, Elara Voss was repeating the process, leaving small, permanent shifts in her wake, teaching the same lesson in different rooms. Quiet is not surrender, and when the time comes, some people need no more than half a minute to end a problem forever. Outside Fort Redhaven's gates, The world moved on without knowing a thing about the 30 seconds that had altered the base's undercurrent. Elara Voss moved with it, stepping into the kind of assignments that left no record in public logs. She surfaced briefly at a coastal training facility in the Pacific Northwest, her name missing from any official billet, but her presence noted by those who had been there long enough to recognize skill that wasn't taught in their program. From there she vanished again, the trail going cold until a detachment in Eastern Europe logged an unconfirmed sighting. A quiet American working alongside NATO logistics officers, her eyes always scanning the edges of the room. The SUV that had collected her from Redhaven months earlier had delivered her to the kind of building where doors stayed locked from both sides. Inside, a briefing that wasn't called a briefing laid out her next steps. She listened without interrupting, took the sealed folder offered to her, and left without asking questions. What mattered wasn't the assignment itself, but the freedom to operate without the constraints she'd tolerated on the base. Out here, she wouldn't be anyone's contractor. The work was quieter than people imagined, more about shaping conditions than direct action. But the readiness was always there. She kept the same habits, back to the wall, 2 exits mapped, awareness extending beyond her immediate surroundings. They weren't just survival reflexes anymore, they were part of how she navigated the world. The people she worked with changed from operation to operation, sometimes a small team of seasoned operators, sometimes a handful of civilians with specialized skills. She didn't build attachments. She left behind competence, and in some cases, the faint imprint of respect from those who'd noticed the discipline behind her restraint. News from Fort Redhaven reached her indirectly, carried in fragments by transient personnel or embedded in innocuous chatter. The mess hall incident never came up directly, but she could tell by the way some visitors described the tightening of discipline there that the ripples had reached farther than she'd expected. Maddox's name was mentioned once, by a Marine captain who had crossed paths with him during a supply coordination. Keeps his people sharper these days, the captain had said, like he's seen how fast things can go wrong if you don't. On a rainy evening in an unnamed city, she sat across from a contact in a dimly lit cafe, steam curling up from a chipped porcelain cup. The man leaned in and said, "They're still telling that story, you know, 5 against 1. She didn't acknowledge it, only sipped her coffee, but her eyes sharpened slightly. "Doesn't matter where you go," he added. "People remember the ones who don't waste words." She set the cup down. They can remember the story, just not the name. Her world didn't allow for roots, but it didn't need them. The lessons she left behind in each place, on a base, in a training compound, inside a temporary operations center, were enough to outlast her presence. The 30 seconds at Fort Redhaven had been one example. It would not be the last. Somewhere ahead, another room would misread the silence, another group would mistake composure for weakness, and she would be there to correct them. Efficiently, decisively, leaving nothing behind but changed behavior and an empty seat by the window. Months after Elara Voss had disappeared into the long corridors of work without names, Fort Redhaven carried on under new rotations and fresh rosters. The barracks smelled of boot polish and detergent, the motor pool rang with the same metal-on-metal clatter, and the parade ground echoed with shouted cadence. But in the places where routine met memory, the shape she'd left behind still held. New recruits arrived from training depots, bringing with them the same mix of bravado and uncertainty every intake carried. They came with stories too, tales picked up along the pipeline, half true and already worn at the edges from retelling. Among them was one about a nameless woman who dropped 5 soldiers in a mess hall without spilling her coffee. No location, no date, no proof. It was told in a dozen variations. Sometimes she was an MP, sometimes an intel officer, sometimes a civilian with special training. No 2 versions matched perfectly, but the core never changed. 5 against 1, over in less than a minute. Maddox heard the story from a pair of newcomers one afternoon as he passed the weight room. They spoke with the eager certainty of people convinced they were sharing something fresh, not realizing they were telling it to the man who'd watched it happen. He didn't stop them. He didn't confirm it either. Some lessons worked best as rumor. Inside the mess hall, the table by the window remained strangely untouched. It was never formally assigned, never marked off limits, but regulars gave it a wide berth. The occasional newcomer would try to claim it, but the quiet glances from others, those who had been here longer, usually convinced them to move without explanation. It had become a silent marker, a reminder embedded in the room's geography. The 5 who had faced her were different men now, though none of them spoke about why. Mason Kerrigan kept his head down, his confidence redirected into tasks he could measure and control. Rafe Varela avoided situations where a crowd might turn into a mob. Troy Madron worked harder, longer hours, as if trying to overwrite a line in his own history. Luke Serrano took to shadowing senior NCOs, learning without drawing attention. Evan Rocha channeled his restless energy into training drills, always first to volunteer for grunt work. They'd never say it, but their conduct was its own testimony. Maddox, for his part, didn't soften. He tightened his oversight, called out arrogance earlier, and made it a point in every initial briefing to remind new arrivals, you don't know who you're dealing with until you do, and by then it might be too late. It wasn't theater, it was insurance. The mess hall incident, stripped of its specifics, had become part of his own doctrine. Beyond the gate, he sometimes wondered where she was. Every now and then, a whisper reached him through unofficial channels, a sighting in a joint exercise overseas, a mention from a visiting officer who spoke her name like a password. He never chased the threads. People like Elara lived in the spaces between assignments, surfacing only where they were needed. One rainy afternoon, while crossing the yard, Maddox paused at the sight of a new contractor unloading supplies. The woman had the same quiet efficiency, the same economy of movement, and for a moment he thought, but no, the posture was different. The eyes didn't scan quite the same way. He moved on, telling himself it didn't matter. The lesson had already been taught here. It would last longer than any one person. In the months that followed, Fort Redhaven saw its share of disputes, challenges, and small acts of stupidity. But none crossed the invisible line that incident had burned into the base's culture. People remembered without knowing exactly what they remembered. They adjusted, they respected boundaries, and in those adjustments Maddox saw the lasting imprint of 30 seconds in a mess hall, proof that sometimes the most enduring changes come not from speeches or policy, but from a moment so sharp it cuts away the old ways of thinking all at once. Somewhere out there, Elara Voss was moving toward her next set of coordinates, her next nameless table in her next unfamiliar room. She would sit the same way, eyes on the entrances, hands steady over whatever task put her there. And if another group decided her silence was an invitation, she would teach them what Fort Redhaven had already learned. Quiet is not weakness, and when the time runs out, 30 seconds is all it takes to find out the difference. Some stories fade as soon as they're told. This one didn't. The 30 seconds in Fort Redhaven's mess hall never made an official headline, never appeared in a training manual, and yet it became part of the unspoken code that ran beneath the surface of the base. People stopped calling it a fight. They called it a moment. A moment when arrogance collided with skill, when the weight of assumption met the precision of preparation, and the outcome was so decisive it rewrote the rules for everyone who heard about it. Elara Voss never returned to Redhaven. The gate closed behind her that morning, and she stepped into a world that thrives in shadows and forgotten hallways, the kind of places where names are traded quietly and reputations move faster than orders. She didn't carry trophies, didn't chase recognition. Her work was never about proving something to the wrong people. It was about being ready when the wrong people made the mistake of forcing her hand. For her, readiness wasn't a posture. It was a way of life. On base, the ripples never stopped moving. Recruits still arrived with the usual mix of confidence and naivety, but the story of the table by the window always found them. It might come from a corporal leaning on a railing at dusk, or a sergeant in the motor pool handing down advice that sounded like a warning. However it was told, the ending stayed the same. 5 men down, less than a minute, no wasted motion. It didn't need her name. The power of it was that it could be anyone, and that uncertainty was enough to make people think twice. For Mason Kerrigan and his crew, the lesson was permanent. No punishment could have driven the point deeper than living every day with the knowledge of how quickly their confidence had been dismantled. They learned to measure their words, to read a room before claiming it, to leave space for the possibility that the quietest person present was the most dangerous. They didn't talk about her, not to each other and not to anyone else, but their restraint spoke louder than confession. Master Sergeant Maddox carried the memory differently. For him it was proof that instinct mattered, that his early read on Elara's posture and habits had been right. He kept that insight in his back pocket, applying it to every new face he encountered. It sharpened his leadership, made him quicker to check behavior before it crossed lines. In quiet moments he thought about the way she'd left, no ceremony, no backward glance, and he respected it. Some people didn't need closure. They just needed the next mission. Somewhere beyond the fences and the reach of Red Haven's morning formations, Elara kept moving. Maybe she was in a coastal city, blending into the traffic of a dockyard, eyes on the freighters pulling in. Maybe she was sitting in a safe house kitchen in another hemisphere, cleaning a sidearm while 2 colleagues argued over maps. Wherever she was, she would have her back to a wall, her exits mapped, her mind already 2 steps ahead of the room. The world wouldn't know her story, but it would feel her work in the spaces she left behind. Quieter places, sharper eyes, fewer assumptions made at someone else's expense. If there's a lesson in what happened, it's this: strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. The people most capable of ending a confrontation often choose not to start one. They let the noise pass them by until the moment comes when silence is no longer an option. And when that moment arrives, there is no confusion about what will happen next. Elara Voss didn't prove herself in the mess hall that day. She reminded the people watching that respect is not something you demand through intimidation. It's something you earn, and if you can't earn it, you'd better know enough not to challenge the ones who already have. Think about the places you've been, the rooms where you sized someone up in an instant. How often were you right? How often did you mistake quiet for weakness? The recruits at Fort Red Haven won't make that mistake again, not because they read it in a rule book, but because they lived the consequences. They learned that 30 seconds can feel like a lifetime when you're on the wrong side of preparation, and that no number of allies will save you if every one of them is outmatched before the first move is over. Wherever you're watching this from, whether you've worn the uniform or not, you've seen versions of this play out. The underestimated co-worker who knew the answer before the meeting began. The neighbor who never brags about the work they do, but shows up when it matters most. The stranger in the crowd whose calm feels like a warning if you pay attention. Those are the people you respect without needing to be told why. Those are the people who change the rules just by being in the room. At Fort Red Haven, they'll keep running drills, keep swapping personnel, keep serving breakfast in the mess hall, but under all of that, the story will stay alive, not because it's dramatic, but because it's instructive. 5 against 1. less than a minute, and a lesson no one wanted to learn twice. If you take anything from Elara Voss's time here, let it be this: pay attention to the quiet. Measure people by their actions, not by how much space they take up when they walk into a room. And remember that the calmest water often runs over the deepest currents. So, where are you watching from tonight? Have you ever seen someone change the rules in a single moment? Tell us in the comments. Share this with someone who understands that true strength doesn't need an audience. And if you believe that the most dangerous people are often the ones you'd never suspect, stick around. We've got more stories like this waiting for you, because here we don't just tell tales, we remember the moments that leave a mark. And this one isn't going anywhere.